Great. Well, good morning to everyone and welcome to what I believe will be a very interesting conversation that we'll have today on the, I would dare say, the topic of the hour, the topic of the day, of the week, of the month, maybe the topic of the year, which is the new Biden administration, the new administration in the US, which has just started yesterday, and what it means for the transatlantic bond. A transatlantic bond that needs to heal, because by healing, it can actually start solving the many global problems, many global challenges that actually needs a bit of passion in this transatlantic bond if we are to be efficient and successful in addressing those issues. The second reason why this conversation is, I believe, going to be very interesting is because of the parties to this conversation. On one hand, we have two outstanding journalists, Steven Erlanger, who won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, who's the diplomatic correspondent of New York Times, a career spanning over decades in the most prestigious publications that he worked for, and Darren McCaffrey, the political editor of Euronews, who's been grilling European leaders, prime ministers, presidents of the Commission, Secretary General of NATO, so on and so forth. And today, I'm going to play a very interesting role for a politician, which is I'm going to ask the questions to the journalists and play the journalist myself. On the other side of the conversation is a very interesting audience, an audience that I, at least personally, tend to like the most, which is students. Students from law school, from business and economic school, from administration schools, postgraduate programs in Romania, a country that has always held the United States on a very high pedestal, has always regarded the US as a beacon of democracy, as a model to follow. And these students, with many of whom I've actually had interesting conversation in the course of last year, I always find they have very timely, very interesting, very inquisitive questions about the world around them. So with these parties to the conversation, I am convinced that we're going to have an interesting chat in the course of the next 2 hours. Few of the house rules. We will start with a brief intro on a question which I guess it's obvious. I'm going to put it in a second. And then for the first more or less 40-50 minutes, I'm going to engage in a fireside chat with Darren and Steven on what I believe, based on, there is a mic which is open and I would kindly ask you to turn it off. On the questions that I have picked up myself in the course of the various conversations that I've had over here in Brussels, in the European Parliament, with my colleagues sitting either in the LIBE committee, which is my main committee, or in AFET, where I also sit, or in SEDE, the Security and Defense subcommittee of AFET, or very interestingly and topical as well, in the Artificial Intelligence Special Committee, which I also have the honor of chairing since September last year. So for the first 40-50 minutes, we'll engage in this conversation among the three of us. And then for the remaining 1 hour and a bit, we will open the floor to questions coming from the students themselves. I know there is great interest. My understanding is that in a rough call that we've launched yesterday, there were about 70 students who were interested to ask questions. We won't have time for all the 70 questions for sure, but I will ask them when the time will come to then raise their hand, those that want to ask the question directly, and engage in the conversation with my two distinguished guests. Those that are more shy, they can ask the question in the chat, and we will select them from the chat and then put the questions to either myself or the two interlocutors. So with that, I will kick off with maybe the simplest of questions, but also the one which is probably in the minds of everyone, which is, how does this first day in office, one could say that yesterday was the first day in office for President Biden because he's been busy. He signed 17 executive orders in the first couple of hours after he stepped into the White House. Executive orders ranging from migration to climate change, basically fulfilling the promise that he's made throughout the campaign, which is that he will undo many of the policies that Trump has held very high on his agenda in the course of his presidency. So is this the beginning of the healing that the American society needs? Is this the beginning of the healing that the transatlantic bond needs? I have my own views and I'm going to express them in a second, but I would like to start with my guests. I will start with Steven and ask you, how does it look from your perspective? How does this first day in office for the Biden administration look like from the New York Times point of view, from your point of view? Steven?
Well, I have to say, it's going to be more boring. And I hope that's a good thing. One of the things that struck me so hard listening to President Biden's speech yesterday was how reassuring the expected words were. They weren't always thrilling. Sometimes they were cliches, but it was a relief to hear talk about unity, to hear talk about ending polarization, to hear talk about bipartisanship, as hard as that's going to be, and not hear the words we heard 4 years ago, which were about American carnage and how America has been screwed by the world and America first. So this is a kind of restoration, and the Democrats treated it that way. But I think we all need to be careful because, in fact, when you look at the results of the election, Donald Trump nearly won re-election. I think he would have won re-election without the virus happening. If you look at the number of votes he lost the key battleground states by, they were fewer than the votes Hillary Clinton lost those key battleground states by. So, you know, we still have a very tied Senate. We have difficult things to do, but I think the tone was very, very good. And the first day was, you know, beautifully done in symbolic terms. He also signed 17 executive orders, which mostly overturned some of the most egregious Trump orders, for instance, on immigration, on a so-called ban on people from Muslim countries without special vetting, et cetera, et cetera. And I think he restored, at least in the majority of the country that voted for him, which is something like 52%, some sense of real hope. But the hard work really starts, and there's a lot to do.
Thank you, Steven. Darren, how does it look from the European point of view? How does this first day look like?
Well, we have to remember, of course, Donald Trump branded Joe Biden as Sleepy Joe. And I think there's many people hoping that it might be Sleepy America when it comes to the next 4 years. To add to that word about what we think the next 4 years will look like from at least the Brussels point of view is more predictable. And that is certainly a big relief to EU leaders, pretty much, I think, across the board. I think to a large degree, you know, as Stephen was pointing out, though, is Joe Biden going to be able to sort out all the internal problems in the United States in the next 4 years? Almost certainly not. It's a country clearly deeply divided. Donald Trump got over 70-odd million votes, more than any incumbent US president has ever received in history. I think what Joe Biden hopefully internally can prove to do is to lower the temperature in America. But, you know, is he going to solve many of those problems that led to people voting for Donald Trump? No, he is not. And that poses a problem, I think, for us who are not in the United States, because it means that the Biden presidency, to a large degree, will probably be quite an inward-looking one. It'll probably be one that is taken up by internal affairs. We know, for example, at the moment, they're already having to deal with clearly the pandemic, over 4,000 Americans on average dying every single day. That is going to consume the first, at least 6 months of the Biden presidency, particularly ramping up the vaccination program. Things like immigration, a fiscal stimulus to get the economy back on its feet. These are going to consume Biden's first 100 days. It's not going to be international relations. However, there are clearly key issues in which Brussels, Europe, and the White House are united on, again, most notably on climate change. Joe Biden re-signing up to the Paris Accords last night. That is clearly a very significant move. We know that Britain is hosting COP later this year, which will be a significant moment, again, in terms of trying to tackle climate change. And you know what? The European Union, the UK, and the US will be on the same page, maybe even China. So it will be a significant moment. He's rejoined, or will be rejoining, the WHO. Again, that will clearly be welcome. And there is a sense, and this is probably the biggest thing, Donald Trump didn't like the European Union. In fact, he viewed it as somewhat of an enemy. That is not the case for Joe Biden, quite the opposite. He's a big supporter of the European Union, and that alone is significant. But that is not to say that everything is going to go swimmingly for the next 4 years. They clearly don't agree on everything. Most notably, I think there will be big divisions potentially on China, and that means that the next 4 years will at least still have elements of unpredictability, but it'll be a much more familiar relationship between EU leaders and a US president.
Thank you, Darren. I'll pick up on some of the things that both of you have said to put a bit my own view, and again, it's a view made up of discussions, conversations that I've had with my colleagues in AFET, in SEDE, in AIDA, and a bit the feeling that I also picked up yesterday during the plenary debate that we've had here in Parliament. And that is indeed that while the expectations are very high, and everyone is somewhat in a honeymoon kind of a mood, everyone realizes with realism that that honeymoon is actually going to be short, and it's not going to be the type of honeymoon that one could maybe expect at the start of a relationship. First of all, because this is not a new relationship. If I would compare it to something, it's like a very dear family member who was long gone from home, and somehow he's returned, and now there's first a very awkward silence because you wouldn't know where to pick up the conversation. You know in a way the love is still there, the family bond is still there, but again, you wouldn't know exactly what would be the first words that you want to start with. Realism also because, as Darren was saying, and I think Steven, you're alluding to that as well, I think inevitably the start will have to be a very inward start. It is inward already on our side, on the European side, and I think we can still expect an inertia of that inward-looking attitude, which was, in a way, forced, one could say, by Trump's administration. And we have Europe and European leaders who have been building this dogma of strategic autonomy, and anyone could guess how that strategic autonomy dogma is going to evolve now when trying to rebuild, relaunch, rewarm the transatlantic relationship. On the other end, clearly the US society remains as divisive today as it was 2 weeks ago. And clearly Biden is going to have a very tough time trying to deal with that divide, trying to restore some sort of cohesive view of the American society over itself, as well as over how it relates to the world. And I think that if we are to be good partners, and this is what I said yesterday in the plenary, if we are to be good partners in this relationship, we as Europeans, we have to understand that. We have to understand that Biden is going to need the time, particularly now at the beginning, in the first weeks and months of his office, to first deal with the internal issues in America before it can start paying the right level of attention to the relationship with the European side, which is not to say that he will not remain what I believe he truly is, which is a pro-European and one who wants to invest as much as possible in this relationship. But again, realistically, he will have to first spend time, he will have to first deliver things to the American people. And I think also the transatlantic relationship in the months and years to come has to take account of also the need to deliver. I think a relationship that will be built only on process, on launching, I don't know, some sorts of dialogues and councils and whatever other frameworks will not do. I think that for both sides, the American side and the European side, this transatlantic bond needs to deliver on very concrete things so that both the Biden administration as well as the European administrations can turn back to their constituencies who are paying attention, but who are paying attention also to their own problems before they pay attention to the world problems, that this transatlantic relationship can also deliver for what is important to them at home. And I think that, again, when building the concrete deliverables out of the common agenda, we have to pay attention to these needs, to the American internal needs, to the European internal needs, and then out of that, move on, rise up to how we deal jointly together in a common vision, ideally, with the global problems. And we all know that there are plenty of global problems, from climate change to migration, to the digital transformation, to trade and multilateralism, to security. All of these need us working together. I am of the firm belief that if we don't do this together, the US and the EU, the world is not going to turn on its feet and look again healthier than it did over the last few years. And I'm not only looking at the last 4 years of the Trump administration, because the things were not great before Trump's administration either. So with that, I will maybe ask the first question as part of our fireside conversation, which is, and I'll start with the words of another president, it's the economy stupid. How do you see the economy, both on the American side and the EU side, playing a role in the conversation between the US and the EU? And with that, I draw a line to trade, and I will ask a question. Do you believe that a TTIP 2 is something that could come up on the agenda in the course of the next 4 years as we try to rebuild this transatlantic bond? Stephen, would you fly first?
Sure. Let me just first say, though, that I appreciate this. My first visit to Romania was during Solidarność time, Ceausescu time, in 1981. And I have vivid and sometimes frightening memories of that time, but I was always treated wonderfully by the Romanian people. And one of the great pleasures of my life is seeing the alteration of Romanian life and politics. And if you forgive me for saying that, I really mean it. It makes a tremendous difference. So having said all that, yes, the economy matters whether you're stupid or smart. And we're both drowning in debt because of the virus. It makes sense. I believe it makes sense. Interest rates are low and we need to keep people going and alive. And this will be a debate. It's already a debate on both sides of the Atlantic. Trade is one of those strange issues. I had a long interview the other day with Bruno Le Maire, who's the French finance minister. And the French are pretty aggressive in their way. And he also stressed the issue of trade, but in the sense of let's stop these petty cycles of recrimination and retaliation. Obviously, you have Airbus issues and you have sanctions back and forth. And when the Americans do sanctions, then the EU Commission is compelled to do sanctions, and it goes on and on. So I think he's right. One of the first things that needs to be done is just settle the Airbus thing, get that done. I also think the two sides need to get together on WTO reform, which is actually really necessary, by the way. Both sides agree on that, but Trump and the EU were having all kinds of troubles. TTIP 2, I don't believe will happen. And that's for two reasons. One, America really isn't very interested in trade deals anymore. We've moved beyond that. And the Senate, which is still, don't forget, half Republican, but even Democrats traditionally are not big free traders, Republicans more than Democrats. Trump was more of a protectionist, was very odd. So I think it'd be very hard to get a good trade deal through the Congress. And secondly, I don't think the Germans want it. I mean, half the problem with TTIP in the first place wasn't America, it was Germany. It was a European reluctance to accept American regulations and American standards on food and other things. There are all kinds of conspiracy theories about genetically modified food and Frankenstein chickens and all sorts of rubbish that the Germans, who you would have thought would have loved free trade, I think they were as responsible for the thing falling apart as anyone else. Now on the Asia side, there was a very good opportunity for TTP, which was aimed at China, and Trump pulled out of that. I think that was a big mistake. I expect the Biden people will try to get back into what has resulted from that, which is led by Japan. And then the other key thing, because trade is at the center of this for the European Union, because after all, that's mostly what the European Union is about, is China. And there's no reason to believe that our interests are exactly the same. The US is a peer rival to China in a way that the EU is not. That changes things. And I don't think Europe wants to be the co-pilot in an American jet fighter plane aimed at China. That's not going to happen. And Europe has its own economic interests. Having said that, the two sides do agree on working to get China to become more transparent in its investment dealings, to start cutting state subsidies to companies, to stop stealing all kinds of intellectual property, to stop manipulating its currency. And so I think that the dialogue on China will essentially be a dialogue on trade with China. And I think that's very important. I'll stop there. I've gone on too long.
Thank you, Steven. Darren?
So first of all, just on terms of the internal US economy a little bit first, which is when you asked if the economy stupid, and Steve was very, very pointedly point out it is whether you're stupid or smart. And there is, big fundamental problems. As I said, there's a massive mountain of debt, as there is in most now Western economies, given this pandemic. However, with interest rates as low as they are, in fact, many governments essentially are being paid for their debt at the moment. It's not a bad time to be borrowing money. Clearly, there will still need to be quite substantial stimulus for economies for months and months and months to come. But at some point, taxes are going to have to go up. This is going to have to be paid for at some stage. How that happens and at what stage will be really important. But also, there's a lot of people with a lot of money. Corporations have actually hoarded quite a lot of money. They've not been investing in the last year or so. And, there are a lot of people who've lost their jobs, a lot of people who have suffered in these recessions that we've seen this year because of the pandemic. But there are also a lot of people who've seen actually quite secure employment and have saved up an awful lot of money because they haven't simply been able to spend it. And it is potentially that money will be released and that we could actually see quite a significant bounce back from these deep recessions. Might see an inflation spike or whatever, but it's not all doom and gloom is what I'm trying to say in terms of the economy in the United States or indeed the economy in Europe. However, the fundamental default line in politics, actually on both sides of the Atlantic, is about real wages for lots of people. You know, when you look at the reality is that many Americans have not really seen the real wages increase for decades. And that's one of the reasons that many of them actually are in some ways quite angry about the current system, because they feel that they simply have not benefited. And there is a big element of truth to that. In terms of trade between the two blocks, Steve's right. I don't think there's any, any sense that TTIP 2 is somehow going to happen. I don't think there's the political desire really actually in both Washington or Brussels for it to happen, least of all the internal politics and the complexity of it. People are too distracted by other things to start doing that. Do both sides want to see an end to this kind of tit for tat petty trade war that we've seen over the last 4 years or so? Yes, they do. And I suspect there'll be, be more conciliation on that. Interesting when it comes to China, the Biden administration, who were in transition at the time, made it clear they weren't terribly keen on that investment strategy that the European Union signed up to over the Christmas period.
Right.
And I think we will see pretty significant fault lines when it comes to China. Interestingly, Steve was right in saying the EU doesn't want to be a co-pilot to America's approach to China in many regards. One country that does thus far seem to want to be a co-pilot, interestingly, is the United Kingdom. It has taken a pretty hard line, unsurprisingly, in Hong Kong, but also on the situations with what's happening with the Uyghurs, which the United States has defined now as a genocide, essentially. And the UK, I think, seems to be joining the United States and taking a much harder line, whereas there are those really deep divisions within China, and that will spill into a trading relationship, clearly. But in the end, as I say, we will see a more transatlantic trading normality between both sides in the years to come. But that doesn't necessarily mean that trading relationship that has existed for most of the post-war period will remain as it is. I think this is a United States that is a bi-oceanic nation that will increasingly be looking more to the east than it traditionally has done to the west.
Thank you. Maybe I'll echo a bit on China, since both of you mentioned it. Also simply because we've had ourselves in the Renew group, which is the political group that I'm part of here in Parliament. We've had ourselves 2 or 3 quite robust discussions over the last 2 weeks related to this investment deal that kind of popped a bit out of nowhere at the end of last year. And there's, I'll tell you frankly, quite a lot of discontent, at least in our group, first of all, as to how it actually popped up. The fact that it kind of went under the radar politically, at least for many. And 2, the fact that actually it happened, and it happened a bit in a vacuum from all the other considerations, strategic considerations that are on the agenda of European Union and the member states when it comes to the relationship with China. Many in the last year before, but mostly also after COVID, were talking about reconsideration of the EU strategy towards China. And then, interestingly enough, even before the elections, we had an interesting paper coming from the Congress, kind of launching an invitation to the EU to consider a joint approach to China on the transatlantic line. And then all of a sudden, this investment deal. So yeah, I do think that, well, inevitably China is going to be a topic on the top of the agenda for the first meetings that will happen and for the conversation that will take place between the leaders on both sides. And while indeed the positioning is different between the EU and the US, I do think that there is quite a number of points of common interest and common ground, where in fact, at least I'm hoping the 2 sides will see the approach to China the same. Steven, I see you wanted to add something.
I mean, not to interrupt you, but here I'll be a journalist and not a politician. But I mean, I am very intrigued. I mean, I wrote myself about this China investment deal and the upset about it. The commission is being very defensive about it, and Borrell is being very defensive about it. And obviously, Angela Merkel wanted it desperately after 7 years. And obviously Xi Jinping wanted it desperately, which is, I think, what made people very nervous, why he suddenly made these concessions, because for him, the upcoming 100th anniversary of the Communist Party is a really big deal. And the 20th Party Congress is a really big deal. And he wants something to point to. And much as he did 4 years ago, if you remember when Trump was elected, he went to Davos, Xi Jinping, and started defending multilateralism when Trump was against it, right? And here, just before Biden comes in, Xi, with EU help, creates a shot across the Biden bow saying, I can deal with Europe separately. So I think that's the problem. I'm curious to ask you whether you think it will be ratified. Most people think it will be talked about for the next year or so. And the French seem, because Macron has his own elections in 2022 and the French presidency starts in January 22, want this thing to be ratified when the French have the presidency. But I'm not sure it'll happen. I'm curious. And from the Biden point of view, I've talked to some of them. I think they've basically decided they're not going to make a fuss about it. What's done is done. Maybe it'll get ratified. They want a good relationship with the EU. They certainly want one on China. There's just no point, moaning about this, at least publicly. So I think they're going to put it over on the side, maybe use it to embarrass the commission from time to time, but not make a big public fight about it. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Well, as I told you, I'm not sure that the temperature is the same in all of the political groups in this House. I can tell you that in ours, the temperature is quite high, and it remains to be seen when we will actually start a deliberation in Parliament about this thing, which we haven't had. Well, we had one some time ago, but this is one of the issues with the way Commission works on these deals, and sometimes with the Council as well. You have these mandates which are lingering on for years. And you can choose a very narrow perspective and say, listen, it is only about investments and conditions about investment, so no harm done. And it actually plays out rather well for the European companies, and there are a lot of favorable conditions in there. So why not? It's actually a good opportunity for Europe and for its companies. But I at least believe that you can't simply take this narrow perspective. Not when it comes to someone like China. You have to look also at the strategic implications, and that is not only valid from the transatlantic relationship point of view. Even let's say if we were in a Trump 2 scenario and we were very strong on our strategic autonomy story, I still think that the way we should have looked at this deal should have been much broader, more strategic, looking also at the European interests beyond investments. And the many points which are not positive on the agenda between the EU and China. That's at least the view again held in our group. We'll see how the discussion will unfold in the coming year. Whether this will actually see the light of day eventually or not remains to be seen. I think the jury is still out there, because it will depend a lot on how, again, the discussions will continue. I would swing to Darren. Did you want to add?
I don't know whether we're going to come on to this, but I just want to make the point about it's got less to do with trade, but it has got to do with the economy to a degree, and we're going to see this. I think we are going to see a bit of a battle, aside from the kind of trading of goods, when it comes to American tech companies in the years to come. But all I would say, and Vestager will and others will continue to attack, understandably so, the almost monopolistic power of things like Google and Amazon and Facebook on Twitter. But this is where Europe, in a sense, need to get its house in order too. I mean, these are all American companies, and that should be pretty shameful for Europe. You know, when you look at Europe's top 50 companies, none of them, not one, was created in the last 40 years. And I get the need to desire, of course, in the globalized world we do, and the influence these companies have in Europe to regulate them, or at least try to mitigate some of their excesses. But at the same time, Europe does need a bit of internal reflection on that fact. That we are relying still very much on technologies and businesses of essentially the mid-20th century and not the 21st century, and Europe needs to spend a lot of time on that, less time on thinking about how we can curtail and regulate American companies, and more how we in this continent can create them.
Well, Darren, you've perfectly anticipated what was my second question to you, which was exactly about the digital. And not only because, well, I chair the Artificial Intelligence Special Committee, but because of the small earthquake that happened here in Brussels in December with the adoption of the DSA and DMA, which is basically the political statement you were saying, Darren, that we haven't reflected. Well, it seems like we have, at least the Commission has reflected and decided to put forward these proposals. Very much targeting the US tech giants. At least the DMA is de facto a piece of regulation about the GAFAM, whereas the DSA is about everything else, the digital realm in general, but clearly with stronger conditions and rules for the big platforms, again, all of which are US platforms. So my question to you, and over the last few weeks, I've had discussions also with lawmakers on the US side. And it's interesting also how the events of the last 2 weeks, since the storming of the Capitol and the story with Facebook and Twitter taking Trump offline, how do you see Europe's attempt to put rules into place for moderating content, for controlling content, the conditions in the DSA, asking Facebook, Twitter, social media, marketplaces to actually exercise responsibility over the content that they hold, including issues which clearly impact politics and democracy and freedom of expression. How do you see this playing into the transatlantic relationship? What do you think the the companies, we could all venture a guess what they think, but what do you think the administration feels like and will say when they would first be discussing the digital agenda with European leaders?
Shall I go?
Yeah. Please, Steven.
Oh, okay. First, we have a big problem already with this second Schrems ruling. And that's very complicated, but basically it says that you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of it is that US data privacy regulations aren't sufficient to make the European Commission happy. And basically that means that it's very difficult to send data back and forth, particularly data on even passenger lists on airplanes, not that many are flying these days. So that's a big problem, and that needs to get resolved. I think it's a really interesting debate. It may be the key ideological debate for our democracies in the next couple of years, despite all the other problems that we have. Social media has changed so much, and personally, I think to put the power of regulating content in the hands of the owners of these platforms is a terrible mistake. It's just not right. Rich, powerful people shouldn't be deciding. This is not just a highway over which all kinds of junk passes, and the people who own the highway say, we have no responsibility over what's traveling on the highway. They need to be regulated by government, by elected officials who have the legitimacy to create law. In the way that American utilities were regulated, the way in the old days, normal television was regulated. And it's going to be very difficult to do because it's so big. You know, Facebook has billions. I'm not sure how many billions, but I think it's half the planet or something. And how you look at everything, I mean, it has to work with artificial intelligence. It can't just be done. You know, you would need hundreds of thousands of editors. It's almost impossible. But they all need to be much quicker at taking down material that is dangerous, blah, 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 libelous, etc. But people are very clever in hiding that material. So I think, you know, the US is looking for guidance from the European Union, which has already begun to try to work on this. I think it's very important. There are questions of digital tax also that shouldn't be forgotten. I mean, you know, the French in particular have a national tax on big tech. Should there be some sort of global tax through the OECD? People have tried to negotiate that. It hasn't worked so far. But I think really the issue of who controls and who regulates this massive, chaotic, sometimes wonderful, sometimes depressing mess that is social media is really a key question for freedom of speech, for democratic principles, for the way we do our politics. I think it's really important, and I'm glad that people are thinking hard about it. I'm not sure, I think people have come up with very good answers yet, to be sure, but the Americans are looking to Europe, at least, for examples of how it might be done.
Thank you, Steven. I fully share your views. In fact, some of the students that we have that are watching today, I had a chat with them last week, and I was telling them that I consider this to be the mother of all debates for the years to come, and not necessarily from a market or competition point of view, but from the point of view of what it means for democracies, what it means for the way we express our views. Again, it's going to be very interesting in these conversations that we're going to have now across the Atlantic, hopefully more and more and more constructive. Leaving the companies themselves aside, it's going to be very interesting whether in the politician-to-politician conversations that we'll have, we're going to build some sort of a common view, common world view as to how, in fact, all this the digital reality around us needs to be, can be regulated, set in some frame that still respects the openness and the need for freedom of expression, but also brings in responsibility. So it's going to be a tough conversation here around the two proposals that the Commission has put forward. There'll be another one coming in a few months' time on artificial intelligence that will also be stirring quite a lot of debate. And at least from the few discussions that I've had with lawmakers in Congress in the last 3 months, it's yet unclear whether over there the need for regulating beyond the antitrust typical investigations that the DOJ does is seen in the same way. I'm also curious to see whether the last 2 weeks and what has happened with the assault on Capitol and afterwards is changing somewhat the political conversation in Washington. But again, clearly, this is going to be a very, very important debate, very divisive debate over here. And I bet also on the US side as well. Darren, how do you see this?
So I fundamentally disagree with both of you.
Good.
So first of all, I think when it comes to things like Twitter and Facebook, my kind of profound sense is that they should remain as platforms, essentially, should not be treated as publishers. Now, how does that square with obviously Jack Dorsey's decision to remove President Trump from Twitter? I would say, and he has said this himself, that was acting essentially within the current legal system. And of course, don't get me wrong, I don't think the internet should be the Wild West. I do think that the laws that are currently in place around incitement to violence or incitement to hatred, or indeed when it comes to defamation, should still remain in place. So essentially, you cannot go online and defame someone and get away with it. If someone wants to take libel action against you, they should be able to. So I do think that where there are national laws already in place, that they should be applied to those platforms. But beyond that, I don't think they should be regulated. Interestingly, of course, and Angela Merkel made the same point as Steve about how, the information flow shouldn't be in the control of wealthy individuals. I would argue if they remain as platforms, in essence, it doesn't. But you know what? Who's owned newspapers for the last couple of 100 years? Wealthy individuals, and for most of that time, that was their main source of information, and that was controlled by wealthy people. The great thing about the internet is that yes, lots of people believe wild conspiracy theories, though I would argue they always have, but at least they've got the ability to check it. I grew up in a rural town. I didn't 3 miles from a rural town in Ireland. My access to information 100 years ago was ridiculously limited. It was pretty much probably based on hearsay of what people, kind of Chinese whispers probably emanating from Dublin. Today, people have got the ability to check a whole range of information, to consume a whole range of information. Some of it we won't like. Some of it is made up and ridiculous, though, as I say, that has always existed. And my fear is that if we go down the route of more regulation, like we do with, which we don't do really with newspapers, but we do with broadcast media in most of Europe, who gets to decide this? Yes, you talk about elected representatives, and we may well feel perfectly fine with, I don't know, Angela Merkel and the German parliament drawing up regulations for internet companies in what's allowed to appear on their platform or not. Could others take advantage of that? Would we be, if you were Hungarian, whose media is already under an awful lot of pressure, do we want the internet space also to be regulated by Viktor Orban and the Hungarian parliament? I don't think that many people would feel terribly comfortable with that. So just because you're an elected representative, I don't think it might give you a bit more legitimacy, but it does, you go into a troubled space in many regards. So in the end, the internet is a wonderful thing. It's also a dangerous thing. I think, as I say, that laws that clearly are in place, which means that you cannot, as I say, defame someone or incite violence, should remain in place online. That is why Donald Trump was booted off Twitter, because Jack Dorsey judged that he potentially could incite further violence in the final 2 weeks of his presidency. Some may well suggest he had done that beforehand. And of course, it is not ideal. I think my big criticism, Twitter's a private company in the United States. In many ways, it can boot people off and allow people in as it wants. The problem is not that these platforms are publishers, is that they are monopolies. And that's the big concern, is that there really isn't an alternative or a really well-established one to Twitter or to Facebook. That's the concern rather than the content.
I would say Darren obviously makes some really good points, and that's why it's such an interesting debate. And one of the things that always struck me, I've lived and worked in former Soviet Union Russia, and actually the internet is fairly free in Russia. It's not censored very, very much. And yet people believe what they believe, right? I mean, so it's not just a matter of what's out there. It's also a matter of our socialization, of our political points of view. And of course, propaganda works both ways. So, I mean, this is a very good example, I think, of the debate we all need to have. I think it's really important. I mean, I would have personally preferred that both Facebook and Twitter put context around Donald Trump's tweets, or at least say censor a few of them that were particularly outrageous rather than this blanket censorship. But as I say, it's a really interesting debate. You both have made really good points. Let's have the debate, and because it really is important.
Well, we agree on that. We agree on that.
I think on that we all three of us agree. But I think that's just a very eloquent anticipation of the kind of discussions that we're going to have around the DSA in particular. I think the DMA is a little bit more straightforward in terms that it's pure competition in a way. Unbundling something that you were saying, Darren, as well, looking at the tech giants through the lenses of what they mean as a business and the monopolies that they have created by bundling different bits and pieces of services. So the DMA is going to stir a debate, but only around these sort of competition market policy point of view. Whereas the DSA is going to create this sort of very deep and I will repeat myself, divisive ideological discussion about the freedom of social media, the freedom of internet implicitly, and how much responsibility these platforms should or should not have. I also had yesterday, interesting enough, a conversation with Nick Clegg, together with a group of colleagues here. They seem to be relatively relaxed about the DSA. Or maybe relaxed is not the proper word, but they say, well, they understand where Europe is coming from, and they believe that they, as a company, would be able to do fine with the DSA. But clearly, they see themselves a new era approaching, where clearly they are not going to be able to operate as they have done up until now. And they feel also that on the US side, that debate is coming. Prompted a bit, not a bit, but prompted by what has been happening over the last weeks. I will do one last question before we start with our audience, with the students, which is multilateralism. We touched upon it at the start, and I want to ask whether you think the two sides, the US and EU, regard right now, with everything that has happened and with the state of world affairs today, regard multilateralism in the same way, whether they regard the priorities to be addressed on a multilateral level in the same way, beyond maybe the evident climate topic. And how do you think that re-engagement on the US side in multilateral issues will actually play out, given also some of the divisions that existed before Trump between Europe and the US?
I think it's one of those words that makes my teeth hurt, to be honest. I mean, it's like rules-based order. I mean, it's like one of these phrases that we use. I mean, multilateralism is by definition, it's a good thing. It's countries banding together to get something done, okay? And the world lived for a long time with alliances, which you could have called multilateral organizations if you wanted to. The UN is a great idea. It doesn't always work very well, let's be honest. Part of the problem with multilateral organizations is when you have big powers in them that actually disagree with what's going on. Just look at the WHO. China is a member of the WHO. It pays its dues. It has not wanted to, for a long time, to let the WHO investigate the origins of this virus. And even now that it's finally agreed to let in a team, it's banned 2 people from the team from coming into China. Everyone says, oh, you know, the US is now back in the WHO, that's great. Well, it's fine. I think it's good if it helps get, for instance, vaccines through the COVAX program to poorer countries. But you know, it's not like the WTO has been very successful. I mean, it's what we have. GATT wasn't very successful. I don't know if you consider NATO a multilateral alliance. I think in a way the European Union is by itself a multilateral alliance, right? It's a multilateral organization. It's a group of like-minded countries, for the most part like-minded, that have agreed to share sovereignty on certain issues. I think, you know, despite the religion around the phrase, it's losing steam. This is what worries me in a world where, and it wasn't just Trump, it's, I would call it the newly aggressive rise of former imperial powers in their regions. And by that, I mean Russia in its region, China in its region, Turkey in its region, you can name others. But these are not global powers yet, quite, though they play a very important role, but they are asserting their nationalism. And this is why I love the EU and I want it to succeed, but it is very much the success of the 20th century. And to me, it has a lot of challenges in this century faced with this new kind of regional neo-imperial aggression. I think that affects multilateral institutions too. They work on a coordinator level, but as we can see, even in the European Union, common denominator, let's say in foreign policy, is pretty low. So, you know, let's keep trying. I'm glad Biden's going to be invested again in doing it. I mean, they speak all these religious terms themselves. They're all multilateral interventionist types around Biden, very familiar. But the world has changed. China's changed, Russia's changed, Turkey's changed, the US has changed. And I'm not sure we've fully considered what those changes mean for the operation of these institutions. Anyway, it's a dark view, but it's mine.
Thank you, Steven. Darren, before Darren, I will now ask we open the tap. So I will ask our audience to start raising their hand if they want to ask questions directly or put questions in the chat. Now, Darren, over to you.
Well, if multilateralism makes your teeth hurt, Steve, for me, it's definitely strategic autonomy, which Brussels and particularly Charles Michel seems like he's wedded to. I hate that term. Really interesting in terms of multilateralism, because I think this is kind of Biden's big challenge in many regards, is to kind of make it fashionable again. It's certainly definitely fallen out of fashion. And in many regards, this was beyond the Trump era. And that is his big, I think it's actually part of his mission, it must be said as well, but it's certainly a big challenge. When you look at some of those countries that Steve was talking about, and I would add certainly India and Brazil, you know, they're actually all run by quite, to a degree, populist leaders, whether it's Putin in Russia, you know, Xi Jinping in China, Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil. You know, these are big, major world countries and economies who don't believe in multilateralism. And that's the big challenge for Biden is, can the United States, does it still have the power to actually change that? And it is really important. And I think he views it as really important. But as I say, that is the challenge. Looking towards, you know, that's important, I would say, for things like NATO, you know, for trying to make the United Nations work, for trying to reform the World Trade Organization. I think just very briefly on this, closer to home, what's also interesting, I suppose, as a Brit to a degree as well, is Brexit and the European Union and its relationship with the United States and how that might pan out. Clearly, there was a feeling, at least, that Brexit Britain was going to be closer to President Trump, though I think in many regards, actually, most of the administration of Britain and Boris Johnson is pretty pleased that Joe Biden has won the presidency. But what it does mean is, I think, there's always been talk about the special relationship between Britain and the United States. But if you want to talk to the power in Europe, you probably pick up the phone to Berlin. Essentially, what I'm trying to say is I think there will be a divergence, and potentially quite a significant divergence, between actually what the EU wants in terms of foreign policy objectives and kind of Britain trying to carve out almost deliberately its own foreign policy objectives in the years to come, and the United States potentially being somewhere in the middle. And that might make multilateralism with Europe a bit more difficult, because Britain will deliberately try not always to be in key with the 27 of the EU.
Thank you, Darren. I started looking at the chat. I see a first question, which says, well, first, congratulations for the discussion. The question is, in the context of the assault over the Capitol and Trump's refusal to accept the defeat, how do you think that this will affect the relationship between the new administration and the populist governments in Europe, which had close ties with Donald Trump?
I think it's clear that people get along with the American president no matter who he or she is. I mean, America still has that power, the convening power, and the trade power. So you even see someone like Viktor Orban, who was reluctant to congratulate Biden, but did so yesterday after he was sworn in. So, he kind of kept his faith in a way with the Trump people. And after all, don't forget, 74 million Americans voted for Donald Trump to be reelected. The same was essentially true in Poland and other places. You still have in Slovenia some questions. Is it Slovenia or I can't remember, the Slovaks, Jana somebody, right? Yeah, right, sorry. I don't mean to conflate the two, but I do think the EU has an issue with these countries quite separate from the American issue, which has to do with the rule of law, conditionality, and I'd be very curious, particularly as Angela Merkel winds down, whether the position in the European People's Party will change about membership of Mr. Orban's party, etc. So I think, the fact that Trump lost the election was already a big blow, not just to these governments, but to populists all over Europe, from Maloney to Wilders, right, to Salvini and Marine Le Pen. But what happened at the Capitol, and we came very, very close to a terrible, terrible event there. It was terrible as it was, but it was an attack on democracy. I think that shocked voters in Europe so much that many people will say, this is where populism leads. This is where it leads. It leads to a refusal to accept that you've lost an election, and then it leads to violence. So I have seen the populists in Europe pulling back very quickly after the Capitol Hill riot to say violence is not acceptable and blah, 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 blah. So I think the two things combined will have a very important effect. Now, that's not to say people are going to be happy. I think quite a lot of the results of COVID, governments are not popular anywhere because no one has figured out how to deal very well with COVID and its impact. Not the autocrats, not the Democrats, not the populists. So I think there is voter anger out there, and all the problems, which are different in different parts of Europe, populism isn't the same everywhere, obviously. A Polish populist is not an AfD populist. I think the roots of anger are there, and the instruments to make that anger real and political remain. And, you know, we'll have to see how it all works out. But I think that Trump, this combination of loss and violence, I think, is a real prise de conscience. It's a real wake-up call for a lot of voters all over Europe about where populism can lead.
Thank you, Steven. Darren?
Yeah, I think it's pretty damaging as well. It is interesting when you read that statement from Viktor Orban to Donald Trump yesterday. As Steve points out, clearly, obviously, every country will want to have, or every European country have a close relationship with the United States, irrespective of what's in the White House. And you try to find common ground, don't you? I mean, you know, Viktor Orban talks about mutual respect and goodwill, but he focuses on NATO, counterterrorism, and energy resources, where there is clearly agreement even between a Biden White House and Orban's administration in Budapest. But Trump losing is damaging, I would argue, particularly for Slovenia, for Hungary, for Poland, most notably. You know, I have to remember President Duda, before he got re-elected, and only just got re-elected, traveled to Washington 3 days before the election. I was in Poland covering the election campaign. Pretty extraordinary for, you know, someone who's in a very tight presidential race to leave the country a few days before people go to the polls to go and visit the US president. But he viewed it as a boost to his campaign. But he's gone now. President Trump is gone now. President Biden will not look upon the governments in Warsaw and Budapest and Ljubljana in the same way as President Trump does. And that's troubling for those administrations. And it means that actually they've got one less really powerful friend in the world. And if you sit in Warsaw now and you look around about who are your allies, who are your close partners, who do you want to really work close with? Clearly it's not Moscow. It's not probably Washington anymore. Tensions are pretty difficult with Brussels. And you start to look at, you know, who do we have to start moving towards in order to expedite what we want from the world? And I think in the end, what I'm trying to say is with President Trump out of the White House, I think it will force that group of countries actually probably to work and move closer to Brussels. And you know what, that would probably be a good thing for the European Union.
Thank you, Darren. In fact, again, going back to one of the conversations that I had last year with some of the students now present in the call, someone was very much of the opinion that all of these populist governments around the world and some of the victories of populists, and not only in Europe, but also in some of the other regimes that you've mentioned yourselves, from Brazil to Turkey. Well, with Russia and China, it's a bit of a different discussion. But in a way that they were very much emboldened by the withdrawal, first of all, of the US in a way from global affairs, and then clearly emboldened by Trump's election and his model of running a country and running world affairs. So one would therefore draw a very simplistic conclusion that now that Trump is gone, and with unequivocal engagement between the US and the EU on the global stage, that would be the beginning of possibly a loss of wind in the sails of populists around the world. But again, that is, in my view, a simplistic conclusion if we want to jump to one along those lines, because clearly there are much deeper reasons for why populist governments are popping up around the world and are being elected by their societies, and it's not going to be that easy just by setting a new example. But clearly, and now I add my personal view, clearly I think that this sort of new example needs to be set. And I think this is one of the, I would call it, moral duties that I think now the new US administration and the EU have, let's say, on the global stage. to actually give together a signal of strong democratic values and what they mean, and try together again to fight the roots of populism in the first place. I have another interesting question here in the chat, which says US sanctions against Nord Stream 2 have done little to prevent Europe and Russia to sustain their energy cooperation. Do you see a US mitigation of Moscow's energy leverage in Europe?
I've actually written a lot about this. I used to be based in Germany. It's an interesting fight because in a way, there is Nord Stream 1, right? I mean, and life goes on and the world hasn't ended. And Nord Stream 2 is simply a doubling of capacity. Now it's happened, you know, it got signed before Ukraine, before the annexation of Crimea. It was always a big project of the Social Democrats in Germany, not so much of Merkel's CDU. She's kind of embarrassed by it. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the defense minister, had said she'd oppose it if she could, but now it should just go ahead. The Germans are trying to say, oh, it's just a commercial deal. It's become a bigger symbolic issue than I think it deserves. And also the question comes, how much is it needed? Now, if natural gas is, as I think it is, probably the best transition to a green economy, because it replaces a lot of coal and produces much less carbon than coal. And if Germany has, in its Energiewende, gotten rid of all its nuclear plants, and now has the most expensive electricity on Earth because of its effort at only renewable energy. The German hypocrisy is that it's burning more coal now than it's ever done in years. Its CO2 has gone way up after the Energiewende, not down. And so gas, I think one can argue, is a necessary bridge to something better. Now, is it commercially viable? Probably not as much as it used to be, but to me, it's 94% done. And I think the Russians are going to do it, finish it, US sanctions or not. And I expect the Biden people will get into a conversation with the Germans about how to solve this, because frankly, it's a problem for the Germans within the EU. There are a lot of countries, perhaps Romania too, but certainly Poland and others who are very angry about this, partly because Germany put its national interests above EU interests. It's tried to recuperate that a bit with more restrictions and making sure payments are made to Ukraine anyway. And it has seen the Trump administration's push for more liquid natural gas, which is much more expensive, as US self-interest rather than altruism. So it's very complicated. The new sanctions are intended to hurt or to apply to any company that even aids Russian pipe laying. And the European Union is in a funny position because, frankly, it's a secondary sanction on the part of the United States against German towns and companies, right? So people aren't very happy about that either. I mean, there's talk about how to eliminate or how to reduce the power of the dollar. It comes down to the JCPOA, the Iran deal too. How much should American foreign policy secondary sanctions affect European companies and countries and European interests? Very complicated. But given that the Biden people, you know, have a different idea, they don't, as Darren said, see the European Union as a rival and a foe and a competitor, but as allies. I expect the Biden people fairly quickly will move to have conversations with both Germany and the Commission about how to resolve this. One way to resolve it, for instance, I'm sorry I'm going on about it, but was suggested by a former American ambassador to Poland, Daniel Fried, who doesn't like the pipeline, but says perhaps you can introduce sanctions that would only come to bear if the gas is diverted, if the gas is not used properly, if Ukraine gets cut off, I mean, then you can put in automatic secondary sanctions, but not do it right now. Anyway, we'll see what happens. Wir sehen, as the Germans like to say, but I think it's too late. 94% done. They finished the link to Germany. They have permission from the Danes to go ahead. I think it's going to be very difficult to stop it.
Thank you, Stephen. Darren?
Yeah, this is where, just to take a slightly different take on that, because much of what Steve said, I agree with. It's about this issue of strategic autonomy to a degree, and how difficult it is. Actually, you know, Germany's pretty divided when it comes to Nord Stream 2, let alone a continental position about whether the US are right to put on sanctions, or whether it should be part of a sanction towards Russia by turning it off and stopping it from happening in the first place. And, you know, you talk to particularly the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, and they're pretty angry with Germany. You know, Russia's on their doorstep. They really view it as a strategic threat to them, but also to the EU. And they think, you know, how can we be in this position where you've got Navalny, where you've got, you know, people being shot in Berlin parks or being poisoned in Salisbury in England on one hand, and you slap on harsh economic sanctions apparently against the regime, and then at the same time hand over lots of money to because you need to rely on them for gas. It doesn't really square, and it is a real problem. I think, you know, completely right in suggesting that the Biden administration will be a lot more conciliatory. We'll try and find a solution to it. I don't see how it is going to be stopped now, not least of all because Germany's energy needs are pretty desperate in this situation, though at some stage they might be able to wean themselves off it, but that's not for a long time to come. But it does pose a really big problem for, you know, where is the EU on Russia? Where is it? I mean, it seems completely divided and nonsensical to a degree. You know, EU leaders are meeting tonight. They'll probably talk about sanctions again. You had Macron a couple of months ago saying we need to open up dialogue. We've got this deal with Nord Stream 2. I mean, it's just not coherent. Europe's, maybe it can't be, you know, it's a neighbor, it's a big neighbor, it's just there. We do need to rely on it for energy. It's not going to go away whether we have sanctions or not, but there's just no coherency to our position with Russia. And I think to a degree, that's been a frustration for a lot of American administrations, that will be for the Biden one.
Thank you. Two more questions, and maybe I would link them. And I'm aware, Stephen, that you cannot stay for the full 2 hours. So, but we still have a good 20 minutes. So I would still encourage students to.
I mean, I will try, but after this, I'm going to have to leave for a couple of minutes, and then I'll come back in. So
okay, but anyway, if you could still stay with us for this question, because it's very much about the U.S. system, democratic system. So someone is saying, coming back to the Capitol riots, their long-term influence remains rather unclear to me. Could they be considered a black swan, an accident, or a signal of some more serious structural problems in the US democratic system? And I would add, do you think that the checks and balances, as they have been set for quite some time, do you think they have been upset structurally, or do you think that there is an easy comeback after Trump? And maybe the link-up question is that, do you think that transatlantic trust could be won back after the Trump presidency, seeing that another Trump could appear in the future? Do you think that the international standing of US is forever damaged after this?
Very good questions. Forever is too long a time, so let's not go there. Look, what happened was terrifying. It was a serious attack on democracy. It was an attack seen, I think, realistically as an attack encouraged by one branch of government against an equal branch of government. And it was the executive pushing against the legislature. And in essence, that's the terror of it. It's not the crazy people in the buffalo horns and people sitting around on desks with their feet up. It's not even the violence. It's the fact that, and this is why former President Trump has been impeached again. I don't think he's going to be convicted in the Senate, but we'll see. This is what scared people. This is what finally scared Mitch McConnell. This was an interference, not just refusing to accept that the election was free and fair, and to accept the results, which Trump has never done, but to actually incite a mob to try to stop the official certification of that loss is what really went on. And I think it shook people. It shook Mitch McConnell. It shook Mike Pence. It shook a lot of Republicans, not enough Republicans, though I think, you know, the party will try to shed itself of Trump if it can. It's still fairly frightened of Trump because frankly, Trump's base is very energetic, and it's not all crazy people. 74 million people are not all crazy people, right? I mean, they liked what he did on the economy, and they're afraid of perhaps of immigration that's uncontrolled. I mean, lots of reasons why people vote for Trump. Maybe people don't like Biden. Maybe they thought he was too old. Maybe there's issues of race and gender, who knows? But the fact is, these people are there. And they are there for others. Now, you saw Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz, and young senator from Missouri, Josh Hawley, try to grab onto that base by pushing Trump's arguments about the illegitimacy of the election. And they've been punished, I think, by the party. We'll see what happens. But it is important. And it is, as I say, a wake-up call for every democratic system, and I think it will be listened to. Now, I do think checks and balances worked pretty well, honestly, in the sense that Congress stood up and did its duty. They went back to work in this ravaged place and finished at nearly 4 a.m., but did what they were supposed to do. The courts, particularly the state courts, threw out all kinds of legal challenges made by Trump people about election results. The state election boards kept to their duties. And I think in that sense, that's why, if you want to call it a coup, I think it's too much, but that's why this effort to overthrow election results failed. It was in essence because we're a federal state, we're not a unitary state, and because judges and state officials and Congress stood up for their rights and did their obligations. Now, the other very important question you ask, and I've written a lot about this, is given all that, is American policy, especially foreign policy, consistent now? I mean, can you rely on it? It used to be, we used to say that, you know, American political divisions stopped at the water's edge. We used to have basic consensus on foreign policy. We had a pretty bipartisan foreign policy. And on things like NATO, frankly, despite Trump's yelling and screaming, we still do. And we do on Russia too. And we do, unfortunately for some people in Europe, on China as well. I mean, there's bipartisan consensus on these big issues. But people will say, why should I believe Biden's promises? Because, well, one, there could be another smarter Trump-like person who wins in 4 years. But also, 2 years from now will be the midterm elections. They come very quickly. And frankly, I'd be shocked, no matter how good a job Biden does, if the Democrats don't lose the Senate again in 2 years' time. It just takes one or two seats either way, right? So I think that's going to be a big issue. And some people worry that given the state of the economy and the COVID problems and the difficulties, you know, the Democrats, which lost seats in the House. I mean, Biden won, but actually Republicans did pretty well in the legislatures. That you know, if they're not careful, the Democrats could lose the House too. So these are real issues for Europeans, for all our allies, for all our friends. But you know, let's make the best of the next 2 years. And frankly, Europe can help. Europe shouldn't sit back passively. If the Europeans care about the transatlantic alliance, if they care about multilateralism, they need to cooperate and not just lie back and whine and complain as usual about how the Americans are this and that and don't listen and blah, 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 blah. We are listening. The Biden people are listening, but they have to listen to a coherent voice and a coherent policy. And that's the problem of Brussels. And I'm going to stop there. I'm going to leave for about 5 minutes and then I'll come back in. Thank you.
Thank you, Steven. And as you come back, I'll have a follow-up to what you're saying, but
Okay.
I'll wait for you to come
Sorry.
back.
Okay.
Darren, any views on that? On what do we do with the Trump 2? How likely it is? Is that perspective looming over the transatlantic bond something that will actually kind of force us to nudge ahead, but with a handbrake on, kind of at least halfway through, thinking constantly from now on that in fact what has just happened can happen again?
So I think first of all on what happened in Congress, clearly it was horrific. There's no doubt about that. And I get Steve's point that in a sense it was the executive in some ways trying to attack the legislator. But in the end, yesterday there was a peaceful transition of power. It did happen. The checks and balances on the ridiculous fraudulent claims that Donald Trump was purporting didn't work. His pressure on state legislators and on state representatives didn't work. The system held together, and it held together pretty well, it must be said. America's clearly divided. There's no doubt about that. But I'm an optimist, I suppose I can say. I think in the 1960s, America was more divided. It was in a more difficult state. At the end of the day, you had the assassination of a president, the assassination of someone who happened to be his brother, but also happened to be a presidential nominee. You had the assassination of Martin Luther King. You had widespread riots, race riots, and dealing with segregation in the South. You know, America was in a more profound, difficult place in the 60s than it is today. It came through it, and in many ways, it proved to be a more powerful country for it. So I think the United States will recover from this. I think Trump is an oddity rather than something we're likely to see repeat again. I suspect he will not get, nominated again for the presidency in 2024. I probably think he won't get it. Maybe one of his children will try, but they're nowhere near as charismatic as he is. And I think American politics probably, with the temperature lowered, hopefully with a revived economy, the politics in the United States will return to somewhat of normalcy, as they say in the United States. Though, of course, American eccentricities, let's put it like that, have always existed. We've always, as Europeans, kind of slightly looked across the Atlantic with those people with their cowboy hats and their massive assault rifles and thought, what an odd place. And it is to a degree, but it's also a wonderful place. In terms of the more important question, I think, about reputational damage to the United States, I think that is true. I think it's true for two reasons. A, because of that division I've talked about, which is clearly real. And I think that's really important. In fact, it reminds me of what someone had written last year. They said for over 2 centuries, the United States has stirred a wide variety of feelings in the rest of the world. People across the world have loved or hated the United States. They've feared it or they've had hope. They've been envious or contemptuous. They have had awe or anger. But he says, but there is one emotion that has never been directed towards the United States in the last 200 years, but it is today, and that is pity. That many people across the world now look at the United States and they pity it, the world's global superpower. And that's damaging because you don't respect something you pity. And that reputational damage has definitely been done over the last 4 years. But the other thing that is damaging to the United States is its economic and political decline. And that's actually irrespective of Trump. the Chinese economy grew last year, not by as much as it's done in previous years, but it still grew. That's not true for pretty much any European country, and it's not true for the United States. It means that China economically is now going to overtake the United States a year earlier than it previously we thought, in 2028, 2029. On pure economics terms, the United States is threatened and is on the decline compared to the rise with China. And that, of course, means it changes the balance of the world. And it means that the once all-powerful United States isn't anymore. We live in a world now increasingly where we've got two global superpowers rather than one, which has been the case for the last 20, 30 years. And that means America doesn't and isn't as powerful as it was even a decade ago.
Thank you, Darren. While we wait for Steven to come back, I see a question in chat which is particularly relevant for you and I, because it's more closer to home in a way. And the question goes like that. While the relations between the US and the EU were cooling down, Germany has made it clear, in gaining a bit more power in the EU. My question is the following. Do you think that if the US wants a brighter and lighter future with the EU, it has to reconcile first with Germany? And if so, which do you think will be the core topics of negotiation? Well, I guess negotiation or conversation between the two, apart from energy. So is there first a privileged channel that needs to take place between the US and Germany as part of the reconciliation of the broader transatlantic bond? What do you think, Darren?
Well, I think in many regards, of course, there's always that joke about if you want to speak to power in Europe, who do you pick up the phone to? And it still is Berlin, almost certainly. Now, it is clear that Angela Merkel pretty much hated Donald Trump, didn't she? There's that wonderful picture from a G7 or G8 summit of, I think it was in Canada, wasn't it, of her standing over, berating.
It was Canada, yes.
Yeah, rather. I don't know how to describe the face of Donald Trump, but it was quite an extraordinary picture. And it was clear that on personal terms, well, you have to remember, Emmanuel Macron flirted quite a few times with Donald Trump, thought he could tame the beast, and that his kind of garlic charm would somehow get Donald Trump on side. He gave up on the end. The Brits did the same. Theresa May made an effort of trying to be the first world leader to go and visit Donald Trump. Angela Merkel didn't try any of that. She didn't like Donald Trump from the start, and she didn't mind Donald Trump not knowing that she didn't like him. So that's completely different from the Biden presidency, and it does mean that German-US relations will be pretty much back on the same page. They do really agree with an awful lot, but we have to remember also Angela Merkel is not going to be chancellor in 9-10 months' time. She's standing down, and we don't know who's going to be the next chancellor. But on current measures, the potential competitors who might take over, they are a bit softer when it comes to Russia. They are a bit softer when it comes to China. And that potentially could, as I say, create, again, that friction, not masses of friction, but a bit of friction, I think, when it comes to a Biden White House being on the same page of whoever's in the chancellorship in Germany. And I think what it does mean is that, and I think particularly China, because China is going to be the big foreign policy obstacle for the United States for years and years to come. And Europe's not always going to be on the same page. And I do think that's going to be difficult because, during the Cold War, clearly the Soviet Union was an enemy for Western Europe as it was for the United States. There was no doubt about that. But the rise of China actually is a bit more complex and difficult. The United States is going to be a lot more belligerent towards China than Europe's prepared to be. And that's going to be difficult because that old reliance and alliance won't necessarily be there on that issue.
Thank you, Darren, and welcome back, Steven.
Thank you.
If I may, I'll do a follow-up to the question on checks and balances that you answered before, and I'll open up with a very brief anecdote. In early summer of 2016, when I was the head of chancellery of the then Prime Minister of Romania, we traveled to the US on official business, among which we also traveled to Detroit to meet with the Ford CEO for, well, something having to do with the Ford business in Romania. And for the dinner, we were invited to by our honorary consul in Detroit to a gathering which was formed exclusively by very rich Republicans, it turned out. And the conversation of the day, I think it was June 2016, was whether or not Donald will end up being the Republican nominee. And of course, there were views across the table in one direction or another. But what was somewhat the consensus around the table on those rich Republicans sitting at the dinner table was that, well, okay, he's a bit of a clown, but we are going to surround him with knowledgeable and credible and good people. And okay, we can also do with a clown. He's good at raising money. So, well, at the end of the day, what will we do? We'll support him. But again, no worries. We'll know how to contain him. That was the view of those Republicans, June 2016. So now I come back to a question that has to do with checks and balances within the Republican Party. We can also make it a bit broader in political parties in general, because we have the same issue if I am to extrapolate as to how we as European political parties are struggling with some of our own autocrats, and somehow we fail to find solutions for that. But going back to that, do you think that the Republican Party has drawn some lessons? Do you think that they would be able for the next elections to somewhat prevent another Trump, or maybe even Trump himself, to ever become a president again? Have they really learned the lesson?
Time will tell, as people say, right? Remember in June 2016, I had met Donald Trump in the 80s, late 80s. And I thought, you know what he was like in the late 80s. He wasn't a politician. He was just loved attention and publicity. But even then, he had obsessions with trade and how our allies are screwing us. And he was very good at somehow viscerally touching sensitive points in the American psyche, and in the sense that people had that there was an elite that was true of both parties, that was ignoring, quote, real, unquote, people, real, unquote, Americans, mostly white, male, not always well educated, who felt their country was being taken away from them. And you know, this persists, and it's a very strong feeling. Even the riot you saw was pretty male and pretty white, right? And this is the Republican Party's dilemma. It is, in general, the party of white people. It is, in general, now the party, especially of white men. It is increasingly attracted, Trump attracted a lot of Latinos, people who are upwardly mobile, people who feel like, you know, they want to make their money and hold on to their money and be free in their lives and not have a lot of federal government. So the Republicans, yes, they have a lot of thinking to do. In a way, the riot changed the debate, because before the riot, as I said, you had people like Senators Hawley and Cruz and others, and Mike Pence in his way too, through his kind of dog-like loyalty to Trump, who were desperately hoping to inherit the Trump base, the Trump brand, if you like, and ride that into power, because Joe Biden is 78 years old, is the oldest president ever to inherit, I mean, ever to be elected, and his vice president is a wonderful person who the Democrats love, but who I think in some Republican hearts is just what they fear. It's a woman of color, a woman who has power, and this is the Republican base. So, you know, there's always been the never Trumpers, mostly the foreign policy defense elite inside the Republican Party, which is quite considerable. But there's still a fear of the base. And watching what will happen, I think, will be really, really interesting to see, especially, you know, if the Democrats can hold on to the Senate in the midterms, I think you'll feel it change. But already among Republicans, there's this sense that people like Cruz and Hawley and others should be ostracized. And there is a feeling that while Trump might have talked about winning the nomination again in 4 years' time, when he'd be younger than Biden is now, by the way, I think the riots have made that much less likely. So there is, you know, there's hell to pay, but it's only now beginning to happen. And you can see it in Mitch McConnell, who is, whatever you think of Mitch McConnell, who has been the majority leader in the Senate. He is a man who will do anything he can to keep the power of the Republican Party alive, but as we've also seen, within the limits of the Constitution. So it's an interesting question. I don't know the answer, but I mean, certainly there's a debate that's begun, and it will, you know, carry itself out. And the Democrats have to think it through too. As I say, they nearly lost this election, right? I mean, it wasn't like this, yes, in the popular vote, but it's, you know, America, that's not the way we play the game. In the key electoral college votes, I need to repeat it because people don't seem to get it. Trump lost these key battleground states by fewer votes than Hillary Clinton lost them in 2016. So the divisions are out there.
Can I just
Darren? Yeah,
three very quick points. First of all, I'll just pick up actually on the Democrat point, which is really interesting. You know, in many ways, Joe Biden was a good candidate in many ways because he'd been around for a long time. Americans knew who he was, just like they knew who Trump was. You know, he's one of these people that had been in America. He would have been in the American psyche for a very, very long time. So he wasn't a kind of threatening force. But at the same time, I mean, he wasn't exactly an inspiring candidate either. And the Democrats need to be quite careful because actually getting Trump out of office united the divisions within the Democratic Party, which are quite evident, particularly with the slightly more younger, woke left radicals, let's say, in the Democratic Party. And they're not going to go away. And next time around, they won't want a Joe Biden candidate. They'll probably want someone who's a lot more radical. And that poses problems for Democrats wanting to hold the middle ground. In terms of the Republicans, I'll just focus, because Steve did a really comprehensive job there, I'll just focus on Pence. Really interestingly, the Congress riots in some ways were precisely what Pence needed, as they give him the excuse to break away from Trump, which he needs to do, particularly if he's got his own, which he clearly does, political ambitions. And he can distance himself legitimately from Trump, given how horrific what happened on January 6th was. But at the same time, it was troublesome for Pence because it now means he, at least in most of Trump's supporters' eyes, has betrayed Trump. So he's in a sense lost that base with that break, and that's quite difficult. And this is, you know, this is the real problem for the Republican Party going forward, is who can they get that essentially is appealing to lots of voters in the middle ground, but potentially still holds those Trump supporters in the years to come that isn't Trump, and that's quite difficult. And just very finally on the administration itself, because you were talking about competency in the question, and I quite like this summing up. They said that the Trump White House combined cruelty with incompetence, And you can sometimes get away with one, but you can't get away with both. And maybe that is true, but what I would add is actually, thankfully, and I say this thankfully, that the incompetence meant that the cruelty was a lot less. And that's a good thing. And I think actually if you had a more competent, frankly, I would say a more intelligent Donald Trump in the White House, the United States, both internally and externally, could have been a lot crueler, and actually the Trump 4 years a lot more difficult for all of us on the world. So actually, Trump's incompetence, his laziness to a degree, proved to be a good thing for us all, I would argue.
An interesting perspective, Darren.
Whether Steve agrees or not.
No, it's actually an argument that I was using in relation to some of our illiberal politicians and parties back home in Romania. I was always telling people, listen, okay, we are afraid of crooked people coming to power, but be more afraid of the crooked and smart. Yeah. Because they will know, while being crooked and corrupt, if they're also competent, they would know how to actually hide that corruption or play the rules in a way that actually can and somewhat stand some sort of test of democracy. And I think that if we look across to some of the member states in Europe, I think there are some examples of how that is possible. So I actually echo very much what you're saying, Darren. I see another question popping up. Well, one about Poland, which I think, Steven, you already replied, whether the Biden administration will change its stand towards Poland from the Trumps. And I think you've already provided an answer to that, but if you want to add something, please do. But then there's a larger question afterwards, which says, do you think the Biden administration will encourage and strengthen NATO's presence on the eastern flank for deterring Russian threat, as the Trump administration did?
In a way, those two are related. Look, I don't know whether the Poles were really serious about Fort Trump. I never thought actually that they were. But what they wanted was American troops permanently based on Polish soil as a deterrent against Russia. I mean, that's what it's all about. Whatever you think of Kaczynski and Law and Justice, they are obsessed with Russia. They're obsessed with the theory that Russia killed Mr. Kaczynski's twin brother. There's no evidence of that, but it has become a myth for the party and in their heads. So anything that keeps Russia at bay and that keeps America involved and doesn't let Europe just depend on the French make the Poles very happy. And I think that's probably true of Romania. It's certainly true of Hungary. That's one of the reasons why they liked Trump, not because of what he said about NATO, but what he did. I mean, they put in these battalions on the Russian border, which NATO had never done. And the US is in Poland and Canada and Germany and other countries leading them. But we have NATO troops, significant 1,500 each, in all the Baltic states and in Poland. And this matters. And NATO has enhanced its AWACS coverage over Romania and other places. So, you know, deterrence improved under Trump, no matter what he said. Now, the Poles always will want to have a good relationship with Joe Biden and with any American president, and they will. We have no reason to have a bad relationship with Poland or with Hungary. I mean, there are a lot of Americans, you know, Joe Biden calls himself a proud Irishman. There are a lot of Americans who are proud Poles, and they vote too. So it really matters. So in this larger question, will he put more troops in? I do not believe so, because frankly, Joe Biden has never been very eager to send American troops abroad. If one forgets, perhaps, but he was against the surge in Afghanistan. Joe Biden thought the attack on Osama bin Laden was too risky. He's been careful about the use of American troops abroad. This is a lesson he's learned from Iraq, and he's taken it very much to heart. So I think he's going to be very careful. I think he will continue to pull down troops in the Middle East elsewhere. And one of the big questions, I don't know if we've gotten into Darren's favorite phrase, strategic autonomy yet, but it's a big issue and it's a big problem. And it's a big problem for the Germans too. I mean, just what is it and what does it mean and what do the French really want and will there be walk behind the talk? And what will it do to relations with NATO, even though everyone says, oh, it's got to be in the context of NATO. The fact is you can only spend money one time. You can't spend it twice. This is really one of those great issues. So I think he'll be very careful about troops. He's not going to reduce troops. I think Russia will get a harder run under Biden than it did under Trump. There'll be no lovey-dovey secret bromance. Politicians, foreign policy won't be quite so personalized as it was under Trump, even though Joe Biden loves to talk to leaders and has probably met more of them than anyone else. So, again, we'll see. But as Darren said quite rightly before, the first year or so, there will not be a lot of time, energy, and money to spend on foreign policy. It's all going to be concentrated on the virus, the economy, divisions at home.
Darren?
Loads of things to talk about there. First of all, on Russia, I think Joe Biden went to Moscow and he met Vladimir Putin in the Kremlin in 2011. And he sat across the table and he looked into his eyes and turned around to Vladimir Putin and said, I don't think you've got a soul. And said that to his face. Contrast that with President Trump, who obviously never criticized him in public. In fact, obviously there was that famous press conference with President Trump next to President Putin essentially said he believed him over his own FBI and CIA. So yes, the Biden administration is going to take a tougher line very publicly, I think, against Russia. That is good, clearly, for Hungary and Poland, for the Baltic states, because it's quite difficult. I always have to remind myself, I'm from Western Europe and Russia is physically further away, but it's also psychologically further away. Russia's not a security threat, at least in my mind, and I think in most Western Europeans' mind, in the same way that it clearly is, particularly if you live in the Baltic states or in Poland or whatever. So that will be really, really important. And this is the weird thing again, the contradiction of Trump. We always have to remind ourselves, yes, did he undermine NATO? Did he call its existence into question? But by heck, did he increase funding in the essence that he got many more countries to actually pay that 2% of GDP? He did. And is NATO thankful for that? Yes, it is. So in many regards, he actually in the end ended up strengthening NATO in a bizarre way. So again, that's really important. And that kind of emphatic endorsement of NATO will obviously exist under Biden. And as Steve has rightly pointed out, it is one thing that there is bipartisan agreement on in the United States. But I wouldn't get away from the fact that the Biden administration will be more likely to call out, though, and I think publicly potentially as well, some of the internal undermining of democracy in countries like Poland and Hungary. They will be more willing to call out the suppression of the media, the questioning of the judicial independence, the attacks on George Soros, or the underminings of university and civic society. I think a Biden administration will be more vocal on that, whereas obviously the Trump administration was either entirely absent or in many ways actually kind of probably supportive to a degree, at least by its lack of criticism. So, and I think that will force those administrations, governments to think again They will have to think about the impact that might well have, because criticism from Brussels and from Washington still matters, and I think that will weigh heavily. But on Russia, I think they will be pleased with the Biden presidency, in the sense that they'll have the best of both worlds. They'll have that increased NATO spending. I agree with Steve. I don't think they're going to draw back troops. And also they'll have that emphatic attack on Russia from Biden and support from NATO in a very vocal on the world stage. So in many regards, it is good news for many Eastern European countries. But I would just caution that I think a Biden administration will be more willing, and probably will call out some of the internal politics inside those countries.
Thank you, Darren, and Stephen, of course. Well, 3 minutes left. So we're at the famous last words, and maybe just for 1 minute each, let's do an exercise of imagination. So let's say that we are at the end of 2021, not further than that. Hopefully, COVID would be under better control, let's say not done with, but under better control. So it wouldn't be hanging on as a sword above us as it does right now. And we've gone through, both of us, Europeans and Americans, we've gone through our, let's say, inward reflection periods, as I was saying at the beginning, the internal healing that everyone needs to do before we're ready to engage. So where do you see us at the end of 2021? What do you think we would have achieved on the transatlantic relationship by the end of this year? What's your take?
Well, Dragoș, first let me thank you for a wonderful seminar. You handled it really well. It's been interesting to hear you as well, and to all those people asking questions and who have been listening. It's really important, and thank you for all of your patience. By the end of 2021, I think you've described it pretty well. I don't think we're going to be that much farther in advance, but we're not going to be going backward as we've been doing, right? I mean, I think that's really important. If there will be momentum, it will be forward rather than backward. It will be more in terms of friendship rather than rivalry. There will be serious discussions that would be ongoing, it seems to me, because the Biden people are going to need 6 weeks at least, to get ambassadors in place, maybe 8 weeks. I mean, it's hard to have these conversations in 10 seconds. But I think on China, we'll begin to have a serious conversation that ideally will produce some proposals, particularly within the WTO or on trade. I think we'll have resolved the Airbus issue one way or another, which is, I think, very important. And I believe that, there'll be a lot of mutual self-congratulation on climate. John Kerry, we haven't mentioned him, but he's like an Energizer bunny. You can't keep the man down, and he's a former Secretary of State. He nearly won the presidency himself, and he's not going to be shy in his new role as climate czar. So I think you'll find more mutual action and discussion on what I hope will be more of a success in making this recovery a little more green. It's going to be very difficult. Again, it's a question of religion and language, but I think the opportunity is there to put a lot of these investments into better insulation, better windows, better this, better that, to help Europe reach its carbon goals, and America too, as long as we both remember and get together on this, that 40% of the world's carbon right now is coming from India and China together. With our breath, and the world would end unless we get their cooperation.
Thank you, Stephen. Darren?
Also, thank you very much for having us and listening to me natter on, as we say in the UK, for the last couple of hours. I'll make it very brief. As I said, I'm an optimist. I think actually by the end of this year, we will have a glass of champagne in our hands, hopefully on the other side of this pandemic in regards to us having many of our freedoms and enjoyments back in life, which will be good, and that will be celebratory. I think the big thing is that in reality, very little will probably change internationally in the next 11, 12 months, but the tone will have changed. Joe Biden will come and address probably almost certainly the European Parliament. You never know, it might be back in Strasbourg, it might not. He will go to the G7 in England. They will all be terribly glad to see him. He will go to COP and John Kerry, and that'll be a very significant moment in November next year in Glasgow, Scotland. They will agree on further climate emissions. There will be a sense that multilateralism is back. There will be a sense of Europe and the United States. You know, as I say, in reality, very little will have changed, but presentationally and symbolically, things will feel very, very different. And that matters. That's important. It creates an atmosphere. And so I think, you know, by the end of next year, in many ways, I won't say the Trump presidency will seem like a very, very long time ago, but it will seem a lot more distant. And I think maybe unusual as a kind of, wasn't that a weird 4 years? It's good to be back to normal kind of thing. However, I would just caution it by this time last year, we did not know that we'd spend almost a year in lockdown, that there would be a global pandemic. And so I would just caution on that one thought that we should never make predictions, essentially. But I'm going to be optimistic and say things will be a bit rosier by the end of the year.
And I hope by the end of this year, I will be able to get a haircut in Brussels.
And I hope that by the end of the year, I'll be able to...
You know what? I almost hope that's not the case, just to Steve's time.
And I hope I'll be able to board a plane and actually go to the US, speaking of the transatlantic relationship, because I think that is going to be the ability to actually properly talk to each other. I think is going to be, we haven't talked about it, but as we know, a lot of the real politics is done in the margins of meetings, is done in the couloirs. And for the last year, we haven't had couloirs. We haven't had them in Brussels in many of the councils, and I think it's visible already the effects of that. And generally also in international relations, the inability to actually meet and look your partner or your competitor or whatever it is in the eye is a major challenge. So I'm hoping that by the end of this year, we'll actually be able to travel to each other, to actually meet with each other, to meet fellow congressmen, to meet whatever executives that they need to meet, apart from the presidents being able to maybe travel to G7 or to COP or to something else. But anyway, Darren, Steven, I cannot thank you enough for spending more than 2 hours with us, for an absolutely, at least I truly enjoyed the conversation, and I'm sure that our students listening to us and the broader audience enjoyed this conversation as well. And at the end, I'll throw you a provocation, since I prompted you into drawing a lottery ticket and guessing what will happen by the end of the year. I throw you a provocation that we would meet again in this sort of a format by the end of the year, and actually look back on what we said now and see how much of that has actually happened, and whether the world actually looks the way, and the transatlantic relationship looks the way we said it does. So again, thank you very much. Thank our audience for the patience of listening to us for 2 hours. Hopefully this is, and yesterday is the beginning of a much better 4 years, not only for the US, not only for the EU, but I was saying at the beginning, we both have a debt to the world, Europe and the US, and I think we can only fulfill that debt together. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.
You too.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.